Now, do you recall, and obviously you're here talking about what happened on May 25, 2020, involving George Floyd. Do you recall why the officers were responding to cup foods on that date? The original reason for the call?
The original reason for the call was a response regarding a counterfeit situation at the store at the intersection of 38th and Chicago.
And in terms of the deployment of your resources at the Minneapolis Police Department and as chief, how do you rate, I guess, the severity of that offense, the seriousness of that offense?
It would probably not rise to the level of, and particularly in light of last year, the level of violent crime that we've experienced in the city, but we would certainly respond to it, but it would not rise to the level in terms of severity of the crime here.
In looking at the particular type of crime, is that one for which a suspect is typically taken into a custodial arrest?
Typically not.
And why is that?
If it's not a violent felony, we also, in coordination with our jail system and our courts, there's been a shift over the years to make sure that the individuals who are going to jail are those who, from a public safety standpoint, need to be at least in that facility in the Hennepin County Jail. And if we can properly identify and it's not a violent situation, we can always charge via complaint and other things. And so that's one of the reasons why.
You use the phrase, I guess, violent felony. What's the more important part, whether it's violent or whether it's a felony?
Well, violence.
Why is that?
Well, it can certainly endanger not only the officers but the community.
Where something that's merely labeled a felony may or may not require a full custodial arrest.
That is correct.
And are Minneapolis police officers trained in the use of force?
Yes.
In pre-service, in the academy, and also in post-service at the in-service training?
Yes.
And are officers taught the standard that force must be reasonable at the time it is applied?
Yes.
The entire time it's applied?
Yes.
Are officers taught the need to assess and reassess and reevaluate situations in the field?
Yes, we are.
Are you familiar with Minneapolis Police Department's critical thinking model?
Yes.
How are you familiar with that?
It was something that I wanted to embark and make sure that it was part of our training curriculum that also includes the aspects of procedural justice. And procedural justice is really, it's actually research and evidence-based learning that has shown that if police departments treat people with respect, give them voice, establish neutral engagements, and build areas of trust, our communities are more likely to cooperate with us. We're likely to be seen more as legitimate. It is actually shown that our employees come to work, their wellness is better, and so this is very important work. And so it's part of that procedural justice I just mentioned, is part of that critical thinking in our training.
At this time, I'd ask to display only to the witness exhibit for identification 276. Sir, do you recognize exhibit 276 as being MPD's critical decision-making model?
Yes.
Offer exhibit 276.
Any objection? No objection. 276 is received.
Permission to publish. So we heard about the model, now we get to actually see it. And if you could enlarge the graphic, please. All right, so this is what the model looks like. It's sort of a wheel, is that right?
Yes.
And the first stage of the critical thinking model, decision-making model, is information gathering.
Yes.
Explain that, please.
It's very vital. We rely upon trying to gather as much information as possible so that we can try our best to effectively go in, respond, and manage that situation. Trying to gather as much information at the onset is very important, but we also need to make sure that we're continuing to try to gather as much information as we're dealing with the scene or the call.
I see the arrow points in two directions, and one it points to the middle of the circle, voice, neutrality, respect, and trust, and the other arrow points to the threat or risk assessment. Let's talk about the middle of the circle first. Right? What is that middle circle supposed to be representing?
Well, that's the principles, really, of what continues to guide us. So, for example, information gathering, while we may associate it specifically with receiving a 911 call and the dispatcher giving us information, but information gathering could be that officers come across a call that they weren't dispatched to and they need to talk to a community member. If they don't treat that community member with respect or give them voice, it's likely that they will receive less information that will be less helpful in them resolving that call. So that voice, neutrality, respect, and trust, that has to guide and be a part of all of that critical decision-making model.
So let's go to the next step. The officers gathered some initial information, and now the officer is in a position to need to think about it or assess it. Is that right?
Yes.
And so the next step is the threat or risk assessment. Is there a difference between a threat and a risk?
There can be in terms of what is being played out at the time, and you're constantly evaluating that, and of course the information that you're receiving, which may be fluid, is going to dictate that threat or risk. Yes.
And so then once the officer has made an assessment of a threat or a risk, the next step, authority to act. What does that mean?
That may mean the officer now, based upon the information that they've received, evaluating that threat or risk, am I going to act? Is this going to be a physical arrest? Am I going to separate parties? Does this require a report? All of these things. So, but it's giving more information for the officer to guide he or she in terms of what is the next appropriate step they need to act and take.
And so if we were to, at least to this point in the model, put a scenario into action, information gathering, the officer perceives that someone is approaching them with a weapon, like a bat, right? And so then they would reflect on that and determine whether or not this is a risk. It's a bat, maybe the person is at a baseball game, or a threat. The bat is being brandished, correct?
Yes.
Then after that, under authority to act, if they've determined that this in fact is a risk and that they're being threatened, they would look at the authority back to the MPD policy and procedural manual. Is that right?
Yes.
Under what is the use of force policy, what tools are available to me to respond here?
Yes.
Right? The next step then, after considering the authority to act, goals and actions. What is that?
The goals. The officer is making an assessment. So with the authority to act, will an arrest resolve this situation? Will separating the two parties be enough? Is taking a report, will that be enough of a goal or an action? It may mean a combination of things. It may mean that I'm going to have to, or the officers are going to have to make an arrest, but we may need additional resources here because the situation is still could have the potential to not be stabilized. And so all of that is part of that goals and action.
And then to review and reassess, assuming that means exactly what it says. Exactly.
Yes. And information is going to flow, dynamics can change, and so it can be a constant just review and reassess the situation to make sure that we're trying to get to the best possible outcome in this peacefully and safely.
Because circumstances can change, the situation can change, correct?
Yes.
And force that might be appropriate at one moment might not be appropriate at a different moment, or more force might be needed at yet another point. Is that right?
Yes.